It is minus 43 degrees outside, the kind of cold that doesn't just hurt, where exposed skin goes numb in under 60 seconds, where even seasoned Alaskans stay inside and pray their heating system doesn't fail them. And right in the middle of that frozen nightmare, two men in fur coats are outside, shoveling dirt, building something not a traditional log cabin, not a fancy prefab home, something different, something that, on paper, sounds almost too simple to work. A Quonset hut, half-cylinder, corrugated steel, the kind of structure the military used to store equipment in World War II. When the thermometer outside reads minus 43, the temperature inside this thing is sitting at a comfortable 22 degrees Fahrenheit warmer than any traditional cabin in the same area. Some builders report the gap is even larger, 65 degrees warmer than comparable structures nearby. No fancy heating system, no smart thermostat, no expensive imported insulation foam, just steel, stone, dirt, and physics. If you've ever dreamed of owning a cabin, a real off-grid retreat, a bug-out shelter, a homestead that could actually keep you alive when everything else fails, you are about to understand exactly why this forgotten military structure is quietly becoming the most talked-about shelter solution in the entire American wilderness community. Stay with me, because what these men figured out goes against almost everything the modern construction industry has been telling you for decades. Let's go back to the beginning. The Quonset hut was born out of desperation. It was 1941. The United States military needed a shelter that could be shipped anywhere on Earth, assembled by soldiers with no construction training, and survive conditions that would destroy conventional buildings. They needed it fast, they needed it cheap, and they needed it to work. The solution was elegant in its simplicity. A half-cylinder of corrugated steel, bolted together in sections, anchored to a simple foundation. The arch shape was not accidental. Engineers knew that an arch distributes load more efficiently than any other geometric form in nature. Think of an egg. You can squeeze an egg from the sides with enormous force, and it won't crack. The shape redirects pressure outward and downward instead of concentrating it at a single weak point. The military built over 170,000 of these structures during the war. They assembled them in the Pacific jungles. They erected them in the North African desert. They planted them in the frozen soil of Alaska and the Aleutian Islands, where wind speeds regularly exceed hurricane force and temperatures plunge well below zero for months at a time. And soldiers lived in them, worked in them, survived in them. Then the war ended. The military moved on, and the Quonset hut was largely forgotten by mainstream construction. That was a massive mistake. Here is what modern Alaskan builders rediscovered, and what the construction industry doesn't talk about because there is simply no money in it for them. The arch is only half the secret. The real secret is what you do around it. Look at the image again. Look carefully at what those two men are doing. They are not just building a structure. They are burying it. They are shoveling earth up against the sides of that steel arch, piling soil several feet thick against the walls, creating what engineers call an earthen berm. And that changes everything. Here's the physics. And I want you to pay attention because this is the part that will genuinely change how you think about shelter and heat and survival. The ground is a battery, not a metaphor, not a loose analogy. The ground is a literal thermal battery that has been charging itself from the sun's energy for millions of years. At a depth of just 5 to 6 feet below the surface, the soil temperature in most of North America stabilizes at somewhere between 40 and 55 degrees Fahrenheit, year-round, whether it is the peak of July or the dead of an Alaskan February. That ground does not fluctuate. It does not care that the air above is minus 43. It does not care about the wind. It does not care about the blizzard. 5 feet down, the earth sits there calm and steady, radiating that stored thermal energy outward in every direction, including upward into any structure that is in direct contact with it. Now imagine wrapping the sides of your shelter in several feet of that same ground. You have just replaced the most vulnerable parts of your building, the exterior walls, with one of the most thermally stable substances on Earth. The wind hits that berm and transfers its energy into soil. By the time any cold penetrates through several feet of packed earth, it has lost the overwhelming majority of its intensity. What reaches the interior of the structure is not minus 43. It is something far, far closer to the ground's natural temperature. That is where the 65-degree differential comes from. It is not magic, it is geology. But earth berming alone doesn't explain everything you're seeing in that build. Look at the interior walls and the doorway of that structure. See those stacked stone blocks? That light brown masonry? Most viewers scroll past that and think it's just decoration. It is not decoration. That is thermal mass, and it is the second critical layer of this heating system. Here's how it works. Stone, brick, and dense masonry materials have a remarkable property called specific heat capacity. In plain language, they absorb heat slowly and they release heat slowly. When you light a fire inside a structure with stone walls, the fire doesn't just heat the air, it heats the stone. The stone soaks up that thermal energy like a sponge. It stores it, and then, hours after the fire has gone out, sometimes 6, 8, even 10 hours later, that stone is still slowly releasing warmth back into the space. Traditional wood frame cabins have almost no thermal mass. You heat them, they get warm fast. You let the fire die, they get cold fast. In extreme cold, a wood cabin can drop to dangerous temperatures within a couple of hours of losing its heat source. A stone-lined Quonset hut with earthen berming, the thermal momentum in those walls carries the interior temperature for hours. In some documented builds, the interior remained above freezing for nearly a full day after the heat source was completely removed, while outside temperatures sat at -30. This matters enormously for survival. If your fire goes out at 2 in the morning, the difference between life and death might be measured in how long your shelter holds its heat. Stone walls buy you time. Stone walls might be the hours you need to restart your heat source without losing consciousness to hypothermia. Now, let's talk about something almost no other video on this topic addresses honestly. Cost. Because the moment most people hear Alaskan cabin, their mind immediately jumps to a number with a lot of zeros. Custom log cabins in Alaska routinely cost $200,000 and up before you bought a single piece of furniture. Prefab homes shipped to remote Alaskan locations can run $300,000 for $100,000 more, because everything costs more when it has to travel that far. A Quonset kit, a genuine structural grade galvanized steel arch kit of the size you're looking at in this build, roughly 20 feet wide and 40 feet long, can be purchased for somewhere between $5,000 and $15,000, depending on the manufacturer, gauge of steel, and end wall configuration. There are suppliers across North America who sell these kits ready to ship. The arch goes up in days, not months. And here's the part that genuinely surprises people. The labor is unskilled, not in an insulting way, in the most empowering way possible. The construction skills required to erect a Quonset arch are within reach of almost any physically capable adult who can follow instructions and use basic hand tools. The panels bolt together. The ribs follow a consistent pattern. There is no complicated framing, no load-bearing wall calculations, no licensed structural engineer required for the basic shell. 2 people, shovels, a willingness to work in the cold. That is what you see in this image. 2 ordinary men building something extraordinary. The earthen berming costs almost nothing if the soil is on-site, and in Alaska, there is no shortage of soil. The stone for the interior thermal mass walls can often be sourced directly from the build site or nearby riverbeds. The lumber for door framing and interior finishing is the single most expensive material component beyond the steel kit itself, and even that is modest compared to conventional construction. All in, including insulation, a basic with stove, interior framing, and finishing materials, builders in Alaska have completed functional, livable Quonset mini cabins for under $25,000, some significantly under. Compare that to a traditional cabin. Compare that to a prefab. Compare that to the cost of buying into any kind of developed property in a remote area. The numbers are not even in the same conversation. Let's talk about heating costs over winter season, because this is where the long-term financial argument becomes overwhelming. A conventional wood frame cabin in Alaska with standard fiberglass bat insulation in a wall cavity typically requires a serious, sustained heat source running most of the day and night through the winter months. Propane costs in remote Alaska are brutal, sometimes $4 to $5 per gallon when delivered, and heating through a full winter can require hundreds of gallons. Wood stove users burn through cords of firewood at a rate that demands significant harvest time in the fall. The earthen berm Quonset changes that equation at a fundamental level. When the structure's thermal load is dramatically reduced, because the walls are not fighting against -40 wind chill, but are instead insulated by the ground's natural 50-degree stability, the heating system has to work far less hard to maintain a livable temperature. Builders who have instrumented their Quonset mini cabins have reported maintaining interior temperatures of 65 to 70 degrees, with small wood stove burning modest amounts of wood for just a few hours in the morning and a few hours in the evening. Not all day, not all night, just those focused burn periods to top up the thermal mass. The stone walls do the rest. Over a full winter season, the firewood or fuel savings compared to a conventional cabin can be dramatic, and in a survival or off-grid context. That efficiency is not just about money, it is about labor. Every cord wood you don't have to cut and haul is hours of your life returned to you. Every gallon of propane you don't burn is weight and cost and logistics eliminated from your life. Efficiency in extreme cold is survival. There is one more thing about this build that almost nobody talks about, and it might be the most counterintuitive part of the entire story. The arch is not just strong. The arch is self-maintaining under snow load. Traditional peaked roofs with conventional framing require careful engineering to handle the weight of accumulated snow. Get a heavy late-season snowfall on an improperly designed roof structure, and you're looking at a collapse risk. In Alaska, roof collapses under extreme snow load are not hypothetical. They happen every winter. The half-cylinder arch of a Quonset handles snow load in a fundamentally different way. The curved surface naturally encourages snow to slide off as accumulation increases. And on the sections where snow does stay, the arch-shape converts that downward compressive force into horizontal force that travels along the curve of the arch and transfers into the foundation, exactly the same way a Roman arch converts the weight of a stone bridge into force that pushes outward into the abutments rather than downward into empty space. This is not a new discovery. This is 2,000 years of architectural understanding applied to a 21st century shelter problem. The arch does not need to be shoveled. The arch does not need to be reinforced after a blizzard. The arch simply continues to hold, season after season, because its geometry is inherently suited to load distribution in ways that flat or peaked roofs simply are not. Add the earthen berm to that equation, and you now have a structure that is actually stabilized by the earth pressing against it from the sides, the same earth that is keeping it warm. The berm that insulates the structure is also helping to anchor it. The thermal solution and the structural solution are the same solution. That is elegant engineering. Here is what I want you to actually take away from this. We live in a culture that has been trained to believe that better always means more expensive. That warmth requires smart technology. That survival infrastructure requires contractors, architects, permits, and six-figure budgets. These two men with shovels, building in -40 cold, are proving that assumption wrong in the most direct and physical way possible. The knowledge required to build this structure is not proprietary. It is not patented. It is not locked behind a paywall or a professional certification. It is physics. It is geology. It is 2,000 years of architectural wisdom about how arches work, combined with the most basic possible understanding of how the ground holds heat. You do not need to live in Alaska to apply this. Earth berm structures built on the same principle exist in Montana, in Wyoming, in the Canadian Rockies, in Scandinavia, in the highlands of Central Asia. Anywhere the ground holds stable temperature and the air above it turns brutal in winter, this principle applies. You do not need a massive plot of land. Many cabin versions of this build, sleeping loft, small living space, with stove, storage, can be completed on footprints as small as 16 feet wide and 30 feet long. That is a livable, survivable, genuinely comfortable off-grid retreat on a footprint smaller than many people's living rooms. You do not need a construction crew. The men in this image are proof. 2 people, cold weather, basic tools, a steel kit, some stone, some soil, and the willingness to understand why this works before you start building. The most powerful shelters in human history were not the most complex. The igloo kept Inuit families alive in conditions that would kill an unprepared modern adult within hours, and it is made of compressed snow. The Earth Lodge kept Great Plains communities warm through brutal winters for thousands of years, dug into the ground, covered with soil, thermally stabilized by the earth itself. The Roman arch has been holding up stone bridges for 2 millennia without steel reinforcement. Every one of those solutions is based on the same underlying principle. Work with the physics of the natural world instead of against it. Use the thermal properties of the ground instead of trying to overpower the cold with brute force heating. Use geometry to distribute load instead of trying to overpower structural stress with more material. The Alaskan Quonset mini cabin is not a new idea. It is a synthesis of all those old ideas applied to an affordable, accessible, buildable solution that any motivated person can replicate. The men shoveling dirt in that frozen field are not just building a cabin. They are building proof. Proof that warmth does not require wealth. That shelter does not require a contractor. That surviving, genuinely thriving, in one of the harshest environments on Earth does not require technology or complexity or money that most of us will never have. It requires understanding. It requires physics. It requires a willingness to pick up a shovel and trust what 2,000 years of human ingenuity has already figured out. The ground is warm. The arch is strong. And 65 degrees warmer than everything around it. That steel shell and those stone walls and that packed earth are quietly, stubbornly, magnificently doing exactly what they were built to do. Keeping the cold out. Keeping the warmth in. Keeping the people inside alive.